The cave mouth opened like a dark exhale against the white hillside, barely visible unless you knew where to look. Snow had already begun to gather in the pine branches overhead, and the wind carried that particular metallic taste that came before serious weather. Inside, where the rock walls narrowed into a space roughly the size of a small bedroom, Eleanor Voss was checking her firewood supply for the third time that week, not out of anxiety, but out of habit. She had lived here for 2 years now, and the neighbors in the valley below still talked about her like she was some kind of curiosity, a puzzle they couldn't quite solve. The hunting cabin she'd inherited from her uncle had burned down one October night, taking with it most of what she owned. Insurance money was slow, and winters in the northern Rockies were not. She'd found the cave during a tracking expedition, a natural shelter with a narrow entrance that opened into a surprisingly dry chamber. The back wall had a natural chimney effect, a vertical crack that drew smoke upward when she built fires in the right spot. She'd spent weeks that first autumn making it livable, clearing debris, flattening the floor, building a stone fire ring with proper airflow, sealing cracks with clay and moss to prevent drafts while maintaining ventilation. She'd hauled in gravel for drainage, constructed a raised sleeping platform from salvaged lumber, and installed a tarp system that could be adjusted to keep out rain and snow while allowing smoke to escape. Down in Pinewood, the small cluster of homes and a general store that served as the area's only real gathering point, people had opinions. At first, they'd assumed she was camping temporarily, waiting for spring to rebuild or move on. When she stayed through the first winter, then the second, the gossip shifted from concern to mockery. Tom Reichert, who ran the store and considered himself the unofficial mayor of their scattered community, liked to joke that Eleanor was going full caveman whenever someone mentioned her. His wife Linda would smile tightly and change the subject, but the joke had spread. Kids asked their parents if the cave lady ate bugs. Teenagers drove up the access road sometimes, trying to catch a glimpse, treating her like a local cryptid. Eleanor heard most of it. Small communities have no secrets, and the handful of times she came down to buy supplies, lamp oil, salt, ammunition, fabric for repairs, she could feel the stares, hear the whispers that people barely bothered to lower. She didn't blame them exactly. She understood that choosing to live this way, to reject the propane heaters and electric lights and grocery store convenience they all depended on, felt like a judgment on their choices. It wasn't. It was just practicality meeting circumstance. The cave was dry, defensible, and required no rent. Her skills, tracking, hunting, preparing game, fire management, weather reading, were things her uncle had taught her starting when she was 8 years old. She'd guided hunters for 6 seasons before his death. She knew how to survive cold. But knowing and doing are different things, and every evening as she banked her fire and sealed the cave entrance with the heavy canvas and wool blanket system she'd devised, she was aware of how thin the margin was. Fire was life, but fire was also risk. Too much smoke and you suffocated. Too little heat and you froze. Moisture was enemy, and necessity both. She'd learned to manage it all through close attention and adjustment. Her water came from a spring a quarter-mile downslope, never fully freezing because it emerged from deep in the mountain. She'd built a stone channel to guide it into a collection pool where she could fill containers without contaminating the source. She bathed rarely in winter, usually heating water over the fire in a salvaged metal tub, and only when weather allowed for the moisture to be vented out properly afterward. Food was the constant equation. She hunted deer in early season, processing and preserving the meat in multiple ways, smoking, drying into jerky, storing in the naturally cold back section of the cave, where temperatures hovered just above freezing. She'd shot a small elk in October, a young bull that had wandered into her territory, and that meat was still lasting, carefully rationed. She supplemented with rabbits and grouse when she could get them, and she'd learned which plants could be foraged even in winter. Rose hips for vitamin C, inner bark from certain pines, cattail roots from the marsh below when it wasn't frozen solid. She kept dried beans and rice purchased from town, stored in sealed containers to keep out moisture and rodents. She wasn't living well by most standards, but she was living, and she was living on her own terms. The thing about winter storms in the mountains is that they don't announce themselves with much subtlety, but people still manage to be surprised. Eleanor had been watching the sky for 3 days when Tom Reichert told a customer that the weather service was predicting a bit of snow, nothing serious. She'd been in town to pick up lamp oil and had overheard him. The sky had that yellow-grey quality, and the birds had already gone quiet. The deer she'd seen that morning were bedding in unusual places, tucked deep into thickets instead of their normal feeding areas. Every animal with sense was preparing. She'd said nothing. It wasn't her job to argue with Tom Reichert's confidence, and experience had taught her that people believed what they wanted to believe, until circumstances forced otherwise. She'd carried her oil and a few other last-minute supplies back up the mountain, taking the route she'd established that avoided the main road. 2 miles on foot with a heavy pack, but she'd done it countless times. Her body was hard from this life, leaner than it had been in the cabin days, and her wind was good. That night she triple-checked everything. Firewood stacked and covered, with enough inside the cave to last a week if she was conservative. Fire-starting materials, birch bark, pitchwood, char cloth, stored in a waterproof tin. Extra blankets and her winter sleeping bag, rated to -40. Food supplies inventoried, water containers filled, medical kit checked, bandages, antiseptic, needle and thread, pain medication, the antibiotics she'd been saving from a dental issue 2 years ago. Tools sharpened, axe, knife, saw, all maintained and ready. The rifle cleaned and oiled, ammunition counted. She slept lightly that night, the way animals do before storms, and when she woke before dawn it was to a silence that meant snow was already falling heavy. She opened the cave entrance carefully, disturbing the blanket system just enough to look out. The world had already transformed. 6 inches down, maybe more, and it was falling in that steady, determined way that meant it wouldn't stop soon. The wind wasn't bad yet, but she could hear it building in the upper elevations, a sound like distant freight trains. By midday, the snow was past her knees in the clearing outside the cave. She'd gone out twice to clear the entrance area and maintain access to her woodpile, working quickly and efficiently. Her breath made clouds in the air, but she was dressed properly. Wool layers, waterproof outer shell, insulated boots she'd resoled herself, gloves that allowed dexterity while keeping her fingers functional. The temperature was dropping fast, and the wind was starting to gust hard enough to create whiteout conditions for seconds at a time. She banked the fire higher than usual, knowing that tonight would test her systems. The cave stayed warmer than outside, but it wasn't heated beyond what the fire provided, and the fire had to be managed carefully. Too hot and you wasted wood. Too cold, and you risked not being able to warm up properly if your core temperature dropped. She'd learned to maintain a steady state, warm enough to be comfortable in her wool layers, cool enough that she wasn't sweating. Moisture was death in winter. Wet clothing meant hypothermia, even indoors. Down in Pinewood, the storm was causing the kind of chaos that Eleanor had expected. The power had gone out around 2 in the afternoon, when heavy snow brought down a line. The road crews had tried to keep the main access clear, but the snow was coming too fast, and by evening the decision was made to pull the plows off until the storm passed. Pinewood wasn't really a town, just a collection of homes spread along 3 miles of valley. Most people had 4-wheel drive and assumed that was enough. Most people had electric heat or propane systems that required electricity to run the fans and thermostats. Most people had refrigerators full of food, but no idea how to cook it without power. Tom Reichert's store had a generator, but the fuel supply was limited, and he was saving it for when things got desperate. His house, attached to the back of the store, had a wood stove that his grandfather had installed, and he'd used it maybe twice in the past 5 years. He spent the first evening of the outage trying to remember how to operate it properly, getting more smoke than heat until Linda finally figured out the damper system. Their neighbors, the Cohens, came over within 2 hours of the power failing, asking if they could share the warmth. The Cohens had electric baseboard heating and a fireplace they'd never actually used, filled instead with decorative candles and smooth stones. By the second day, the storm was historic. 3 feet of snow had fallen, and it was still coming. The wind had picked up to the point where drifts were forming 5 and 6 feet high. The road into Pinewood was completely impassable, and the main highway 12 miles away was closed. Cell service was patchy at best, and by afternoon it went out completely when the tower lost backup power. People started to realize they were isolated, truly cut off, and the jokes about Eleanor living in a cave didn't seem as funny anymore. Eleanor was fine. Better than fine, actually. The storm didn't change her routine much. She still woke with dawn, or what passed for dawn in the whiteout conditions. She still maintained her fire, cooked her meals, kept her living space organized. She went out periodically to clear snow from the entrance and check her surroundings. The cave entrance faced slightly downward, which meant snow didn't accumulate as badly as it could have, but she still had to manage it. She'd constructed a small vestibule area just inside the entrance using scavenged wood and canvas, creating an airlock effect that helped manage cold air infiltration. The hardest part was the monotony and the darkness. Winter days were short this far north, and in storm conditions full daylight never really came. She had a lantern but used it sparingly, relying on firelight most of the time. She'd brought books and had them carefully stored, but reading by firelight was hard on the eyes. Instead, she spent time on maintenance tasks, repairing a tear in her pack, sharpening tools that didn't need sharpening, checking and rechecking her supplies. She practiced fire-starting methods in case her primary supplies failed. She did bodyweight exercises to stay warm and maintain muscle. She rationed her food carefully, knowing that even with supplies, the margin for error was narrow. On the third day, the storm briefly cleared enough for her to see down into the valley. The world was unrecognizable, all familiar landmarks buried under snow. She could see smoke rising from a few chimneys in Pinewood, but it looked weak and scattered. She wondered how people were managing. She wondered if anyone had enough firewood, if anyone knew how to properly seal a house against the cold, if anyone understood that running a generator indoors could kill you faster than freezing. She thought about hiking down, checking on people, but dismissed it. The snow was deep enough to be dangerous, and what help could she really provide? They'd made their choices, same as she'd made hers. That afternoon, she heard the first gunshot. 3 rapid shots, the universal distress signal. They came from the direction of Pinewood, muffled by snow and distance, but unmistakable. She stood outside her cave, listening. Minutes passed, then the 3 shots repeated. Someone needed help. Eleanor stood in the snow weighing options. Going down there meant risk. The snow was thigh-deep in the meadows, probably waist-deep in places where it had drifted. If she broke through into a hidden creek bed or snow pocket, she could be in serious trouble. If she exerted herself too much, she'd sweat, and sweating in cold was how you died. But the shots kept repeating every few minutes, desperate and persistent. She prepared carefully, the way her uncle had taught her. Extra layers in a pack, emergency supplies, fire-starting kit, the medical kit, rope, the rifle. She marked her route in her mind, following ridgelines and frozen creek beds where the snow would be shallower. She left a note in the cave, a habit from guiding days, describing where she was going and when she expected to return. Pointless in this situation, no one would find it if she didn't come back, but habits kept you alive. The journey down took over an hour, exhausting work that had her sweating despite the cold. She stopped frequently to regulate her temperature, opening her jacket to vent heat, keeping her core warm but not overheated. The shots had stopped by the time she reached the edge of Pinewood, but she knew roughly where they'd come from. The Hendricks place, about halfway through the settlement. She found Marcus Hendricks in his driveway, or what used to be his driveway. He'd tried to drive out in his truck despite the conditions, and had gotten about 50 feet before sliding off into the ditch. Now he was outside, trying to dig it out with a shovel, and even from a distance, Eleanor could see he was in trouble. His movements were slow and uncoordinated. His jacket was soaked with snow, classic signs of hypothermia setting in. She called out before approaching. People did stupid things when they were scared and cold. Marcus turned, saw her, and his face went through several expressions: surprise, confusion, then something like embarrassment. Up close, she could see he was shaking badly. His hands were bare, red and swollen. He'd lost his gloves somewhere. "Need to get to town," he said, his words slightly slurred. "Medicine. For Jamie. She's got asthma. Inhaler's empty." Jamie was his daughter, maybe 10 years old. Eleanor remembered seeing her at the store. The situation clicked into focus. Marcus had panicked, tried to drive out in impossible conditions, and was now hypothermic and stuck while his daughter presumably struggled to breathe inside the house. "Your truck's not going anywhere," Eleanor said, keeping her voice calm and factual. "You're hypothermic. We need to get you inside and warmed up, then we'll figure out Jamie." "I can dig it out," Marcus insisted, but his hands couldn't grip the shovel properly anymore. Eleanor took the shovel from him and tossed it aside. "Inside now, where's your wife?" "County offices. She was there when the storm hit, they couldn't get back." So he was alone with a sick kid, no power, no heat, no help. Eleanor put her arm under his shoulder, supporting his weight, and guided him back toward the house. The front door was standing open, heat bleeding out into the cold. Inside was chaos, blankets scattered around a dying fire in the fireplace, dishes piled in the sink, and the temperature not much warmer than outside. Jamie was on the couch, wrapped in blankets, her breathing quick and shallow. Her lips had a slightly blue tint. Not good, but not critical yet. Eleanor assessed quickly. The fireplace fire was almost out, and Marcus had clearly been burning furniture and whatever else he could find. The wood was wrong, probably treated lumber, producing more smoke than heat. "Marcus, sit down here," she directed, positioning him near the fireplace. "Don't move. Jamie, sweetie, I'm Eleanor. I'm going to help you breathe better, okay?" The girl nodded, her eyes wide and scared. Eleanor shrugged off her pack and pulled out her medical kit. She had an emergency inhaler in there, something she'd kept since her own childhood asthma. It was expired, but that mattered less than having nothing. She showed it to Jamie, explained what it was, then helped her use it properly. 2 puffs, held for 10 seconds each. The girl's breathing started to ease almost immediately. The placebo effect combined with actual medication. But the real problem wasn't the inhaler. It was the cold and the smoke. The house was losing heat faster than the dying fire could replace it, and the smoke from Marcus's furniture burning was making Jamie's breathing worse. Eleanor needed to stabilize the situation quickly. She rebuilt the fire properly first, using wood from her own pack, dry kindling and some of the hardwood she'd brought as backup. Within minutes, she had real flames going, proper heat. Then she sealed the room as best she could, closing doors to unused areas, stuffing towels under drafts. She got Marcus out of his wet jacket and wrapped him in dry blankets, then made him drink water from her canteen. She checked Jamie again, kept her wrapped up and breathing slowly, and gradually the chaos began to settle into something manageable. "Why did you come down?" Marcus asked after maybe 20 minutes, once his shaking had eased enough to talk normally. "Heard your shots," Eleanor said simply. She was at the fireplace organizing the remaining wood into a pile that might last the night if burned carefully. "You hiked down in this storm because you heard distress shots? That's what distress shots mean." Marcus was quiet for a moment, staring at the fire. "I thought you were crazy, living up there in that cave. We all did." "I know. I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry, be smarter." She said it without rancor, just statement of fact. "You don't have enough firewood. You're burning furniture and treated lumber, which is why Jamie's breathing got worse. The smoke from that stuff is toxic. You tried to drive in conditions that would kill you. You were outside without proper gloves. Any one of those mistakes could have ended both of you." He looked ashamed, but Eleanor wasn't trying to shame him. She was trying to teach, the way her uncle had taught her. Survival wasn't about being tough. It was about making good decisions consistently. She stayed through the night, maintaining the fire, monitoring both of them, and by morning the immediate crisis had passed. Jamie's breathing was stable, and Marcus was recovered enough to function. Eleanor shared some of her food supplies, showed him how to properly manage the fireplace fire, and explained what needed to happen next. The storm wasn't over. They were still isolated. He needed to gather every burnable piece of untreated wood in the house and prepare to ride out however long this lasted. Before she left to head back up to her cave, Marcus asked if she could check on other neighbors. Eleanor hesitated. She wasn't responsible for Pinewood. She'd come down for an emergency, and now she needed to get back to her own shelter while she still had the strength. But Marcus's question hung in the air, and she thought about those weak smoke columns she'd seen from above. Who else might be in trouble, she asked. The Cohens are with Tom and Linda at the store. They should be okay. The Morgans have a good wood stove and supplies. But the Wilsons, they're older and I don't think they've run their stove in years. And Sarah Chen is alone out on the East End. Her husband's deployed. Eleanor absorbed this information, calculating. 2 more potential problems, and she was already exhausted from the trip down and the night without real sleep. But storms like this separated people who prepared from people who died quietly in their homes, not found until spring. "I'll check on them," she said. "But Marcus, you need to understand something. I can't save everyone, I can't be everywhere. People need to save themselves." "I know. But thank you for coming down, for helping us." She nodded and headed out into the snow. The storm had eased slightly, but the wind was still brutal and the drifts were growing. She made her way to the Wilsons' place first, a small house set back from the main cluster. Smoke was coming from the chimney at least, which was a good sign. She knocked, waited, knocked again louder. Eventually, Ray Wilson answered, wrapped in a bathrobe over multiple layers of clothing. "Eleanor, what are you doing out in this?" "Checking on people." "You doing okay?" "Cold, but managing. Got the stove going yesterday and we're burning everything we can find. Should last." She looked past him into the house. It was warmer than Marcus's had been, and his wife Grace was visible in the background, moving around with purpose. They might actually be fine. "You have enough food?" "For now, we'll get creative if we have to." "Water?" "Filling pots with snow and melting it on the stove." Eleanor nodded. They understood the basics. "You know about carbon monoxide, right? You're venting properly." Ray looked uncertain. Eleanor pushed past him gently and checked their stove installation herself. The venting looked adequate, and they had a window cracked in the living room for fresh air. Good enough. She gave them a few tips about managing the fire overnight and conserving wood, then moved on. Sarah Chen's place was farther out, and by the time Eleanor reached it, she was seriously depleted. The house was dark, no smoke from the chimney, no signs of life. Eleanor's stomach tightened. She knocked hard, called out, knocked again. Nothing. She tried the door and found it unlocked. Inside was freezing, dark, and silent. She called out again. Upstairs came a weak voice. Eleanor found Sarah in bed, buried under every blanket she owned. The woman was maybe 30, small and clearly scared. "I couldn't get the furnace to work," she said. "Everything's electric. I didn't know what to do, so I just stayed in bed." "How long have you been like this?" "Since yesterday morning." Eleanor checked her hands, her face, her feet. Cold, but not frostbitten yet. Sarah was on the edge of serious hypothermia, but she'd survived so far by creating a cocoon of blankets and staying still, minimizing heat loss. Smarter than panicking, at least. "You have a fireplace?" "Yes, but I've never used it." "Come on, we're getting you warm." Eleanor got Sarah out of bed and downstairs, wrapped in blankets. The fireplace turned out to be functional, and there was even a small stack of decorative wood that would actually burn. Eleanor had it lit within minutes, and she pulled Sarah close to the growing flames, monitoring her carefully. Color started to return to the woman's face. "I was so stupid," Sarah said. "I should have prepared better. Everyone told me to get a generator, and I kept putting it off." "You're not stupid, you're learning." Eleanor said it gently but firmly. "But you need to learn fast. This storm isn't over, and I can't stay here." She spent an hour getting Sarah stabilized, showing her how to maintain the fire, explaining the basics of cold weather survival. Sarah had food in her pantry, canned goods that didn't need refrigeration, and Eleanor showed her how to heat them over the fire. She shared some of her own emergency supplies, things Sarah would need to make it through the next few days. "Why are you helping me?" Sarah asked at one point. "Everyone in town acts like you're some kind of hermit weirdo." Eleanor smiled slightly. "People fear what they don't understand, and I don't need them to understand. But you came down anyway, because understanding works both ways. I might not agree with how people choose to live, but I don't want anyone to die." By the time Eleanor headed back up to her cave, it was late afternoon and she was running on empty. The snow had started falling again, heavier than before, and visibility was dropping to near zero. She pushed herself carefully, knowing that exhaustion led to mistakes and mistakes led to death. She followed her earlier trail where she could, but new snow was already filling it in. Halfway up, she had to stop and rest. Her legs were shaking from the effort, and despite her careful temperature management, she was cold deep in her core. She found a cluster of boulders that provided some windbreak, got out of the direct weather, and forced herself to eat some of the emergency food she'd packed. High-calorie pemmican that tasted like survival tasted. She gave herself 10 minutes, no more, knowing that if she stopped too long she might not start again. The cave entrance had drifted over slightly when she finally reached it, but she'd marked it well and knew exactly where to dig. Inside was exactly as she'd left it, and the familiar space felt like salvation. She sealed the entrance behind her, rebuilt her fire from the coals she'd banked that morning, and stripped out of her wet outer layers. Then she made herself eat properly and drink water before finally allowing herself to collapse into sleep. She woke 16 hours later, disoriented and aching. The storm outside was still raging, day 4 now by her count. She went through her routine mechanically, checking all her systems, but her mind kept drifting to the people down in Pinewood. Marcus and Jamie, the Wilsons, Sarah Chen, Tom and Linda, and the Cohens. All of them trapped in houses that weren't designed for this kind of isolation, running on dwindling supplies and improvised heat. It wasn't her responsibility. She'd done more than most people would. But the thought kept nagging at her. She'd seen how unprepared they were. Marcus burning furniture, Sarah nearly freezing in bed. How many other people were out there isolated on the edges of Pinewood, making lethal mistakes because they didn't know better? By midday, she'd made a decision. She prepared another pack, lighter this time, mostly food and medical supplies. She left detailed notes about what she was doing, even though no one would read them. Then she headed back down into the valley. The trip was even harder the second time, the snow deeper and her body still exhausted from the previous day. But she'd committed, and Eleanor didn't do things halfway. She made her way to Tom Reichert's store, figuring that's where information would centralize if there was any. She found the building packed with people. Tom and Linda, the Cohens, 3 other families she didn't know well, all crowded into the store's back room around the wood stove. It was warm, at least, and people had brought food to share. But the atmosphere was tense and everyone looked exhausted. "Eleanor," Tom said when he saw her. He looked surprised and something else. Chagrined, maybe. "You're out in this." Checking on people. She scanned the room, counting heads. "Who's not here?" Tom listed several names, explaining that the Morgans were fine at their place, and he'd had radio contact with a few others who had working battery-powered radios. But there were gaps in his knowledge, people on the outer edges he hadn't heard from. "I checked on the Wilsons and Sarah Chen yesterday," Eleanor said. "They're managing. Marcus Hendricks and his daughter had some trouble, but they're stable now." "We heard those shots," Linda said quietly, "but no one could get out to check." The room went quiet, and Eleanor could read the guilt on several faces. They'd heard distress shots and had done nothing, stayed hunkered in safety while she'd gone out into the storm. She wasn't trying to make them feel bad, but the reality hung there anyway. "What do people need?" Eleanor asked, cutting through the uncomfortable silence. The list was depressing. Several households were running low on firewood or had never had much to begin with. Some had food, but no way to cook it without power. One family had a baby and was worried about formula supplies. The general store had some inventory, but Tom had been rationing it, worried about resupply once the storm cleared. Eleanor thought through the problems systematically. The firewood issue is critical. Who has wood they can share? A few hands went up. "Okay, we need to organize a sharing system. Get wood to people who are running out. It'll mean going out in the storm, but we can do it in teams of 2, safer that way." "We tried that yesterday," one of the Cohen kids said. "Couldn't even get down the street, snow's too deep." "You need snowshoes," Eleanor said simply, "and you need to move during lulls in the storm, not when it's actively dumping. You watch the weather, wait for breaks, and move then." "We don't have snowshoes," Tom pointed out. Eleanor almost smiled. "You can make them. I can show you how. Basic frames from green wood or even skis from scrap lumber. Not elegant, but functional." Over the next hour, she walked them through emergency preparation techniques that seemed obvious to her, but were revelation to them. how to create makeshift insulation using newspapers and cardboard, how to safely melt snow for water without contaminating it, how to set up a buddy system so every household was checking on neighbors, how to recognize the signs of hypothermia and carbon monoxide poisoning, how to ration food effectively, how to maintain morale during isolation. People listened intently, taking notes, asking questions. The woman with the baby, Jen Morris, asked about keeping an infant warm without electricity. Eleanor explained body heat sharing, safe co-sleeping techniques for warmth, how to test formula temperature without a thermometer. Practical things she'd learned from books and experience. By evening, they had plans in place, teams organized to deliver firewood, check-in schedules established, resources inventoried and allocated. Tom opened his store's inventory more freely once he understood the full scope of need, and people began to relax slightly, seeing that survival was possible if they worked together. "You should stay here tonight," Linda said to Eleanor. "It's warm, and we have space." Eleanor shook her head. "I appreciate it, but I need to get back to my cave before dark. I have responsibilities there." "To what? You live alone." "Exactly. My shelter is set up for one person, and I need to maintain it properly. Plus, I'm comfortable with solo winter camping. This room is warm, but it's also crowded, and I prefer my own space." Tom spoke up. "Eleanor, I owe you an apology. Hell, we all do. We made jokes about you living in a cave, acted like you were crazy or running from something, but you're the only one of us who was actually prepared for this." "You weren't prepared because you never expected to need it," Eleanor said. "You have power lines and stores and roads that usually work. I don't have any of that, so I learned to live without it. Different circumstances, different skills." "Still," Linda said, "we were wrong about you, and you came down to help us anyway." Eleanor shrugged. "Hearing distress shots and ignoring them would make me something I'm not." She checked her pack, preparing to leave. "I'll come back tomorrow if the storm allows. Check on anyone who needs it. But you all need to take care of yourselves. Don't wait for rescue. Be your own rescue." She headed out into the darkness, and behind her she heard someone say, "She's incredible." Another voice replied, "She's what we should have been." The climb back to the cave was brutal in full dark, navigating by feel and memory. But Eleanor had practiced this route countless times, and even exhausted, even in a blizzard, she found her way home. The cave welcomed her with its familiar rock walls and the residual heat from her morning fire. She rebuilt it carefully, ate mechanically, and allowed herself to acknowledge how close to her limit she was running. One more day, maybe two, and she'd need to rest properly or risk serious consequences. The storm finally broke on the morning of day 5. Eleanor woke to silence, the kind that comes after days of constant wind. She opened her cave entrance to a world transformed into something alien and beautiful. The sun was out for the first time in almost a week, blinding against the snow. The sky was that particular shade of blue that only comes after major storms, achingly clear. She went down to Pinewood one last time, moving easier now in fresh morning snow with the sun to guide her. The settlement looked like a disaster zone, houses buried to their windows, cars completely entombed, everything under 4 feet of snow. But smoke was rising from most chimneys now, and people were starting to emerge, digging out, calling to neighbors. The road crews had made it in that morning, carving a single lane through the drifts. Power wasn't restored yet, but communication was re-established, and supply trucks were being promised for later in the day. The crisis was essentially over. People had survived. Marcus Hendricks found her near the store, where she'd stopped to check on everyone. Jamie was with him, bundled up and breathing normally. "I wanted to thank you again," he said. "Jamie's mom made it back this morning, and we've been talking about a lot of things, about how close we came. Lessons learned," Eleanor said simply. "More than that, you saved our lives, probably saved several people's lives, and we treated you like a joke. Water under the bridge. You'll do better next time." Jamie spoke up, her voice small but clear. "Can I see your cave sometime when it's warmer?" Eleanor smiled. "Sure, in the spring when the snow melts. I'll show you how to build a proper shelter if you want to learn." Tom Reichert gathered everyone who was out and available, maybe 20 people standing in the snow near the store. "We need to acknowledge what happened here," he said, his voice carrying. "We got complacent. We thought technology and modern life meant we didn't need to know how to survive, and this storm proved us wrong. Eleanor lived through the same storm we did, in a cave, alone, and she came down to help us when we needed it, even though we'd mocked her." People nodded, several looking ashamed. Linda Reichert added, "We'd like to make it up to you somehow. Supplies, help rebuilding something more permanent, whatever you need." Eleanor considered this. "I don't need charity, but I'll accept reciprocity. I helped you when things were bad. Maybe someday I'll need help and you'll remember." "Deal," Tom said immediately. "And Eleanor, you're welcome at the store any time. No more jokes, no more stares. You've earned respect." She nodded, accepting this. The social dynamics of Pinewood had shifted fundamentally. She could see it in how people looked at her now, not with derision or puzzlement, but with something approaching awe mixed with practical respect. They'd seen her skills proven under pressure, and more importantly, they'd seen her character. She'd come down when called, helped without expectation of reward, and taught them how to help themselves. Over the following weeks, as power was restored and the valley returned to something like normal, the relationship between Eleanor and Pinewood evolved. People stopped by her cave sometimes, bringing supplies as thanks, asking questions about winter preparedness or hunting or survival skills. She answered patiently, taught when asked, and maintained her boundaries. The cave was still her home, and she still preferred solitude, but it was solitude by choice now, not isolation by social rejection. Marcus Hendricks organized a community emergency preparedness committee, and Eleanor became their informal advisor. They built up supply caches, established real communication protocols, learned to read weather signs, and maintain backup systems. Tom stocked winter survival gear in the store, things he'd never bothered with before. Good snowshoes, emergency blankets, fire-starting kits, first aid supplies designed for cold weather injuries. Sarah Chen became one of Eleanor's regular visitors, learning skills her deployed husband would appreciate when he returned. The two women developed an unlikely friendship, Sarah bringing coffee and news from the wider world, Eleanor teaching practical skills and the kind of hard-won wisdom that came from living close to the edge. The cave remained Eleanor's home through another winter and beyond. She never rebuilt the cabin, finding that she preferred the simplicity and honesty of her current life. Neighbors no longer laughed at her choices because they understood now what those choices meant: competence, self-reliance, and the kind of preparation that couldn't be bought, only earned through attention and practice. The story of the 5-day blizzard became part of Pinewood's local mythology, told and retold with growing embellishment. Eleanor's role grew in the telling, but the core truth remained. She had been prepared when others weren't, had helped when she could have stayed safe, and had taught them that survival was about decisions, not luck. Years later, when someone new moved to the area and asked about the woman who lived in the cave up the mountain, the answer they got was different from the one that would have been given before the storm. Now people said, "That's Eleanor. She's a huntress, and she's one of us. Probably the toughest person in the valley. You should meet her. She might teach you something that saves your life someday." And in her cave, with her fire banked and her supplies organized and her rifle cleaned and her water collected and all her systems running smoothly through another winter, Eleanor would smile slightly at the idea of being called tough. She wasn't tough, she was just prepared. And that, she'd learned, made all the difference when the storms came and the world turned cold. And the thin margin between survival and disaster came down to the choices you'd made before the crisis arrived. The blizzard had taught Pinewood what Eleanor had always known, that modern comfort was fragile, that skills mattered more than technology when systems failed, and that the person they'd dismissed as eccentric was actually the one who understood how to live deliberately in a world that could turn hostile without warning. She hadn't changed during those 5 days. They had. They'd learned to see past assumptions to reality, and in doing so, they'd saved themselves as much as she'd saved them. And if that story resonates with you, if you're thinking about preparedness, self-reliance, and the skills that matter when everything else falls away, then you understand what this channel is about. We're here exploring those edges, where comfort meets challenge, where modern life meets ancient skills, where the choices you make today determine whether you thrive or merely survive when the storms come. Subscribe to join this community of people learning to be ready, learning to be capable, learning to be the person who doesn't just survive the blizzard, but helps others through it. Because that's the ultimate preparation, not just saving yourself, but having enough knowledge and resources to lift others too. Hit that subscribe button and let's explore what it really means to be prepared.